the Abbotsford Convent. Go to boit.com.au for more info or ring 9417 1983. A 3CR supporter.
Well, here we are, back in the flesh after 2 weeks, kind of wandering around outback Australia in a non-four-wheel vehicle with one or two punches, but that's good. It's good to get out of Melbourne, I'll tell you now. Now, Anarchist World this week will be on. Now, all those of you who are salivating at the possibility of joining the Wednesday Action Group, sorry, unlike me, they have a break. They won't be back till the 6th of February. So, and those of you who are wondering about the dinners, sorry, doesn't happen till February. Unfortunately, other people don't seem to have the same energy that you and I have, because you're listening to the program. Obviously, you're energetic. You actually got up and you switched on the radio or on the live, whatever, on the net or something. So, how am I going to kill this time? Now, don't forget, one of the first major activities of 2019, the Tundaminaway Maulboyheenner commemoration on the 20th of January. That's Sunday. Great chance to get the kiddies, grab them by the ear. If they're under 14, they don't have much choice. Bring them to the Tundaminaway Maulboyheenner commemoration starting at midday sharp at the Tundaminaway Maulboyheenner Monument at the corner of Victoria and Franklin Street in Melbourne. There'll be people talking from about 12 to 1, and if you can't make it, it is being broadcast live on 3CR between 12 and 1. And at 1 o'clock, as we normally do, we will be walking down to the Queen of Victoria Markets to pay our respects to Tundaminaway and Maulboyheenner at the site where we think their bodies were buried after they were executed on the 20th of January. 177th anniversary, why'd you bother? Think about it. Think about the Uluru Conference, was it over a year ago? One of the major recommendations was truth-telling. This is all about truth-telling. I'll speak more about it during the program. So you do have a chance. Now, just in case you've got any spare cash over Christmas, we're doing a few major mail-outs. Yes, we still do mail-outs for public interest before corporate interests. We need 3 or 4, 5, 6, 700 $1 stamps. I'm not asking you to send them all, but if you got a few stamps out there left after Christmas because nobody sends Christmas cards and you bought those stamps but never sent those cards, post them to us at Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. Post Office Box 20, Parkville 305. Every dollar helps, because if you can't help as an activist because you're old, you're infirm, you're bored, you're listless, you can't be bothered getting off in front of the TV set, well, this is one way to help us. We don't ask for money, we ask for $1 stamps. And why $1 stamps? That's what it costs to send a letter. And why do we send letters? The public interest before corporate interests. We've got a Congress coming on the 16th of March, which is a Saturday, looking at policy initiatives. And sometimes when you send people emails, they don't get them. Well, they think it's junk. So when you get a letter, you normally get it. All right, we're almost about to reach the point when the spaceship arrives and beams us up into the stratosphere so we can speak to everybody in Australia as well as the rest of the world via the World Wide Net. This is the Anarchist World this week. It is live. We're about to begin the program. The satellite is upon us. The community radio network has kidnapped us. Here we go.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction, in the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World this week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else.
good day. Not good morning, not good afternoon, not good evening. Who knows when you listen to the Anarchist World this week? Because the program is podcast. You can access the podcast at any time by going to 3cr.org.au. My name is Joseph Toscano. I'm hosting the Anarchist World this week. The program is live. Apologies for the 2 pre-records, but even I sometimes need to have a change of scenery. Forget about the word rest, change of scenery. And what did I do during my vacation? Well, I drove 6,000 kilometres around outback Australia. Dirt tracks, Oodnadatta track, Marie, Cooperpedy, Uluru, you name it. And I learned a lot of things. That Australia isn't just the capital cities. Now, before I start meandering on about that, if you wonder what anarchy is all about, it comes from the word anarchos, which means without rulers. So the idea of the major thrust of anarchist campaigns is about devolving power, which basically means sharing power, changing the mechanism by which we make decisions into an inclusive network, and sharing wealth. Simple concepts. What creates rulers? Inequalities in power and wealth. How do you create a society without rulers? You devolve power, which means you share power and you share wealth. Simple concepts. You don't need a PhD or whatever to understand. Very simple concepts. Unfortunately, in Australia today, as we've all seen over the past 40 years, yes, I'm going to use the 4 words again, relax, during the deregulation, privatisation, corporatisation, globalisation revolution that swept over this land and the rest of the world, is what we've seen is a radical change in the way wealth is both created and distributed. 40 years ago, 2/3 of every dollar, that's 66.666666 cents, that was profit, went into the workers' pockets, the people who actually made that profit, and 1/3 went into the pockets of investors. 40 years later, because of government legislation, because of globalisation, because of corporatisation, because of deregulation, because of breaking down competition in the marketplace by privatising public assets, we've seen that within 40 years, 1/3 of every dollar which is created as profit goes into the pockets of those who create that profit, workers, and 2/3 of every dollar goes to the pockets of investors. So in an era when housing prices are beginning to wobble, not fall, but beginning to wobble and starting to slide, in an era where there has been no wage increases for years, in an era where unemployment seems to be an intractable problem, in an era when casualisation is the main game and subcontracting is the main game, we are in, as a community and as a people, we are in for a pretty tough time in 2019. So, let's look at the issue of housing, because the issue of housing is still, in my opinion, the central issue facing the community, facing us, you and me, and everybody else not listening to this program, facing Australians in 2019. Housing is not just a matter of homelessness. It's a much, 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 much bigger issue. Because obviously, if you're homeless, it's the issue. But it's becoming an issue for a lot of people. What we've seen over the last 20 years is an extraordinary rise in the price of housing. Has housing, through government legislation, which includes negative gearing and other pieces of government legislation, has become a commodity. It has become a speculative endeavour for investors. And at the height of the rise in housing prices, over half of all houses which were being bought by investors. I mean, Australia's an extraordinary country when you think about it. You get a tax deduction for owning more than one house, but you don't get a tax deduction if you're trying to buy your first house. It's quite an extraordinary place, but this is where we live. this is what we have to deal with. So housing. So why is housing important? Well, security. Provide you security. When you and the bank own a piece of land, you've got security. Security of tenure. And anybody who's listening to this program who's rented for years knows how it's almost impossible to make long-term plans in most rental accommodation. So because housing has become a commodity, a speculative commodity, what we've seen is an extraordinary rise in the cost of housing. Not due to the cost of construction, although that has had a minor impact, but due to the fact that this speculative bubble has been created. For example, over the last 20 years, housing prices in the major capital cities have increased between 450 to 500%. That means if you bought a property 20 years ago, worth $250,000, it'd be worth over $1 million now. And it's quite easy to pay $1 million for a 3-bedroom home with a minimal garden these days. As wages have only increased by about 30% during this period, we can see that this country has a major issue because only 1/3 of Australians own their own home outright, and most of them are elderly Australians who've spent all their lives paying off a mortgage. So 1/3 of Australians are renting, and another third are in a little bit of a contract with Lucifer, with the banks, in terms of mortgage repayments. Currently, interest rates have been exceptionally low, and people have been loaded with debt in order to acquire some security as far as housing is concerned. So in 2019, at the beginning of 2019, the issue of housing is the main issue, which affects each and every one of us. It also affects people who own their property outright, because as housing prices escalate, government charges and rates and property taxes escalate. So it is an issue for everybody. So what are we going to do about it? Well, it seems nothing. I know the Labor Party's talking about getting rid of negative gearing for new home sales if they're elected in a few months' time. And I know they made some noises about providing some money for increased private housing. But unfortunately, we are seeing no new ideas enter this space. No new ideas enter this space. None whatsoever. And what we are seeing is the total domination of the housing market, both rental and mortgage, by the private sector. When the state refuses to intervene in providing access to basic necessities like housing, and you leave it to the private market, what we see is an escalation of prices over and over again, because there is no competition. It's a little bit like saying that, in the grocery world there's 2 or 3, possibly 4 major players, but, competition is lacklustre at best. What happens when you privatise public assets? You decrease competition in the community. And this is what's occurred with housing. Because in Victoria, which I'm familiar with, government policies that have basically which are basically designed to transfer the responsibility of providing housing to people who cannot afford to enter the private housing market, has been transferred to privately owned organisations which call themselves, community, housing and affordable housing associations, to fill that gap. While the investment in public housing, not just in terms of creating new public houses, but in terms of upkeep, is non-existent. So what we've seen is a public housing scheme which was designed initially about 60 years ago to provide secure, stable housing accommodation for people who could not access housing in the private rental market because they're on social security benefits or because they earned low wages. That concept is now disappeared. It's gone out the door, disappeared. So what we are seeing is the total privatisation of the public housing sector. So it's not unexpected for us to see an increase in homelessness in the community, a visible increase in homelessness in the community. So, what are we offering as a solution? Well, the solution is very simple. Everybody says it's complex. Everybody says homelessness is complex. Everybody says getting people into their own home is a complex problem. Well, it's a complex problem if you make it complex. I mean, if I had two matchsticks and a matchbox, I could either strike the match on the side of the box and, hey presto, I'm a god, I've created fire, or I could try to rub the two matchsticks together. And what we're seeing with government attempts at the local, state and federal level, especially at the state and federal level, to deal with the problems of housing security and homelessness, is them having a matchbox there ready which they can actually just strike and resolve the problem instantly, but reverting back to the idea of rubbing two matchsticks together. It's quite extraordinary. Now in Victoria, again, which I'm familiar with, we've had a boom in construction only in Melbourne and to a lesser degree in 2 or 3 regional centres, including Ballarat, Bendigo and Geelong. But as far as the rest of Victoria is concerned, construction and infrastructure has been minimal, very minimal to say the least. And that's one thing you learn when you travel. You see things with your own eyes. So what's our solution? Well, our solution is very simple. It is no different to the solution which we offered last year. It is no different to the solution which the 10-day November campaign from the 14th to 24th of November was built around. It's about quarantining, earmarking, stamp duty revenue for public housing. Very simple. Every state has a stamp duty on you having the privilege to buy private accommodation. Okay? You pay stamp duty on it. Simple, isn't it? You pay stamp duty. Very simple. Last year, almost $6 billion was collected in Victoria in stamp duty revenue. If that money is earmarked specifically for public housing, you can do many, many things, not just house people. And this is where people make the mistake of thinking it's just about housing. It's about an economy. It's about how an economy is structured. It's about disposable income. It's about purchasing power. So if we allocate, say, 80% of the money which is collected in stamp duty, $5 billion, and leave the other billion for, repairs and whatever, and increase the Ministry of Housing, you will find that we can resolve a lot of issues. I know words mean everything. That's one thing I've learnt being on the planet long enough. And I was quite interested to see a piece of correspondence from the so-called Ministry of Housing in Victoria talking about community housing. I was quite interested to see that now the Aboriginal Housing Cooperative, which theoretically owns the homes they're given the titles to over a year ago by the Andrews-led Labor government, has now joined a common waiting list. So we've got a public housing list, a community housing list, an affordable housing list, and an Aboriginal housing list, all lumped into one. Because they want us to think there's no difference between community housing, public housing, etc. And obviously there is a fundamental difference. One is owned by private enterprise, irrespective of whether they're for profit or not for profit, and one is owned by the state. Now, if you allocate those $6 billion to public housing, you could eradicate homelessness in 1 month. And those of you who think I've lost my marbles, think about it. Homelessness creates many problems, not just for the individual who's homeless, but for the community that needs to support that individual as that individual battles with the physical and psychological stress and strain of finding themselves homelessness and creating greater medical needs, greater use of resources. If you allocate that $6 billion to public housing, you can spot purchase homes around the state and house people who are homeless. Within 4 months. You would have nobody who didn't want to sleeping rough on the streets of this state and of Australia. Very simple. It's not hard, especially now that housing prices are falling. Great time for a government to enter the marketplace and spot purchase homes. But the idea of public housing is not just to deal with homelessness. It's about housing security. It's about giving people who are now renting, not by choice, but because they can't enter the private housing market, who need security of tenure for themselves and their children, it gives them the opportunity to live in stable housing at a reasonable cost. And normally it's 25% of income. It's based on income and market price. So, if $6 billion was allocated to public housing in Victoria every year, you could house almost 100,000 people every year in public housing. So what does providing secure, stable accommodation for people who are not able to buy in the private marketplace, what are the advantages of allocating this money directly to public housing and not to the community and affordable housing sector, not to the private sector? What are the advantages? The advantages are manifold. 1, providing secure, stable accommodation for families who are having difficulty in the private rental market decreases family violence, decreases the need for police intervention, decreases the amount of resources that are necessary to deal with that dysfunction, increases community security. Secondly, if you have a strong public housing sector and a significant proportion of the population lives in public housing, say 25 to 30%, What that does is it puts downward pressure on housing prices. And as housing prices decrease, what you can see is more people entering the private marketplace and buying housing, especially younger people who can't even afford the deposit these days. Also, if you have a significant proportion of the population in public housing paying 25% of their income on rent, not 50% or 60%, you have a massive amount of money, billions of dollars, which is released into the community, which would kick-start the economy. Simple. There's a huge amount of benefits to the community. People say, well, that money that's collecting stamp duty is used for other things. Well, it's mainly been used for infrastructure development. So what if we've got to wait another 12 months or a year or 2 years or 3 years for a bit more, another road, another railway station, when we can actually secure people's future? So what are we going to do about it? Well, public interest before corporate interest, which I'm secretary of, have made this a priority for 2019. And we're going to keep this issue on the boil. And starting on the 6th of February, that's Wednesday the 6th of February, we'll be rallying outside the Victorian Parliament at 6 a.m. That's right, 6 a.m. to around 9 a.m. every Wednesday in February, starting on the 6th of February. Why 6 a.m.? Have we lost sense of our marbles? I'll tell you why 6 a.m. It's an excellent time. 6 a.m. is the time that homeless people, which are temporarily housed in Burke Street, 50 metres from bloody Parliament House, are ejected from that emergency accommodation to wander the streets. So it allows us to interact with people who are homeless. And between 6 a.m. and 8:30 a.m, thousands of people pour into the city. Thousands. And we will be rallying under the same banner which we used during the 10-day campaign, because we're going to make this a significant issue in 2019, irrespective, because we are the opposition. We are the opposition. Look at the lacklustre opposition to the Victorian, Andrews-led Victorian Labor government we have in this state, in the state of Victoria. Lacklustre opposition. And everybody else across this country should consider following the same campaign. Because if we address the issue of housing security, we address this issue, we as a community can make significant changes to the lives of millions of people in this country and have a hugely positive effect on business, especially small business, and on community security and family security. It's all interlinked. Join the dots. My name is Joseph Toscani. This is the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Now, as I said, I'm Secretary of Public Interest before Corporate Interests. And this year, we aim to register a federal political party, not before the next federal election, but by the end of the year. Currently, we have almost 400 people on the Australian electoral roll who are members of Public Interest before Corporate Interest, an inclusive political party which uses both direct action, as you see by the 10-day protest, and also uses parliamentary politics. We use both. Both direct action and parliamentary politics. So if you want to join Public Interest before Corporate Interest, we're in the state of revamping our web presence, and we're hoping within the next 10 days to have reactivate our YouTube channel. We've reactivated our Twitter stream, and we're redesigning our presence on the net. So why public interest before corporate interest? And a fancy way, for the many, not the few. Because over the last 40 years, we have seen power shift. Power shift from Parliament into the hands of unrepresentative, into the hands of that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. We have seen an extraordinary shift in power where Parliament no longer represents the interests of the people. It represents the interests of that small group that manipulates and dominates economic activity in this country. At the same time, as we see this community and social consequences of these policies, we have seen the rise and rise and rise in our community of division, where race is pitted against race, religion against religion, neighbour against neighbour, all in order to gain some short-term political advantage. People see that the problem is the other, the person of a different colour, the person of a different nationality, the person who speaks a different language, the person who has a religion or no religion. The other has become the problem. And as a community, we are tearing each other apart because we are not willing to address the main issue. And the main issue is structural inequality. The main issue is the pauperisation and marginalisation of the majority of people in this country by destroying the organisations which in the past have acted to protect people, by passing legislation that makes it impossible for people to strike in this country, to withdraw their labour, by passing legislation which makes political activity restricted to such a degree that change is almost impossible. And I've noticed that with the media ascendancy of the ultra-right, that people are calling on the government to use the powers they currently have to proscribe or ban these organisations. Don't forget, the Attorney-General has significant, extraordinary powers in this country. The Attorney-General can ban any organisation at any time because he or she thinks they may pose a threat to Australian society. So any organisation can be proscribed or banned with the stroke of a pen, and if people continue to belong to those organisations or provide financial support for those organisations, they can be jailed for up to 25 years. So if we go on this little banning exercise, I can assure you, it may be some, one or two ultra-right groups today, but tomorrow it'll be us. That's right. Because we are a threat to the government of the day. We are a threat to dominant ideology because we are talking about reversing the changes of the last 40 years. We are a threat because we talk about using peaceful, mass, direct action. We are a threat. And the government has everything, every piece of legislation it requires to deal with you. So think about it. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Now, when you used to go to school and you come back from school holidays and your first essay would be in the English class, what did you do? Yeah, my school holidays were particularly boring because I used to work. But I've been away for 2 weeks. You've been listening to pre-recorded programs, and I thought to myself that it was time to have a look at a part of Australia which I haven't looked at for about 20 years, and that's regional and outback Australia. Because it's easy to think about that Australia is the CBD of the major capital cities. Because you'll find that most activism occurs in the CBD of most capital cities, and somehow we think that's Australia. Well, travelling 6,000 kilometres by road, not fly in and fly out, but by road, in some of the most inhospitable parts of this country and many important regional centres, the single most important thing that I learnt was that private enterprise has nothing to offer regional and outback Australia. Nothing. We may see, as the cities grow fat and bloated by government support and through, business activity, we may think the same policies can be used to reinvigorate regional and outback Australia. Well, you can't. You can't. You need industries. This is a perfect place for, wind farms and solar farms. Not the private sector, but public-owned, publicly managed farms, solar panels, wind farms, which can actually supply energy to most of Australia, as well as surprise work to a significant part of Australia, and actually revitalise these centres. Because they do need revitalisation. A few survive through tourism, but most need revitalisation. And there's no way the private sector is going to provide anything. And that's why I find it extraordinary that many of these places continue to bring back National Party representatives. Because these National Party representatives have been beating the privatisation drum for decades. And no wonder we see the like of Catter and Hanson being able to exploit the situation. Because the cities have forgotten about regional Australia, and especially outback Australia, and especially Indigenous Australians. Just forgotten. Out of sight, out of mind. It's all about what happens in the CBD of the major capital cities. Listen to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. As I said before, we are going to utilise the social media a little bit more this year, a lot more. I'm hoping to do a YouTube presentation for an hour every week, starting sometime this week. And I've restarted activating the Twitter site, Pibci, Pibci _AU, because I think we've reached a critical time in Australian thinking. We can continue to beat the same boring drum and get the same boring standoff and get the same boring, inane results. Or we can try to make this an inclusive country with a political party, Pibci, public interest before corporate interests, which highlights that the central issue facing each and every one of us is the centralisation of power and wealth in fewer and fewer hands. And if we want this to change, as we see around the world, this will only change when it's confronted through peaceful direct action and party politics. So this is your chance to join public interest before corporate interests. Download the application form, Pibci, Pibci.net, Pibci.net. Ain't got a computer? Got a phone? Leave a message on 0439 395 489. Contact, name, address, and I'll send you out some application forms. Or, haven't got a phone, only got a pen and a $1 stamp, write to us at Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. Now, talking about privatisation, the greatest shareholder returns and profits that can be made currently in the Australian stock market is by investing in Transurban. Now, many years ago, over 20 years ago, the Kennett regime entered a pact which was made in Hades, where they gave Transurban the power, a monopoly for a few $1 billion, which they spent building a tunnel, a monopoly on travel between one side of Melbourne and the next. A monopoly. Not only did they give them a monopoly, they also agreed to use the police and the court system to chase people who actually did not pay fines for travelling on this privately owned road. Instead of getting Transurban to chase its own defaulters, as every other private company does, we have the state government running around in circles, blocking courts, wasting police time, collecting extraordinary fines, which can total tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, for people who have not been able or unwilling to pay. Now, to make matters worse, the Andrews-led Labor government has re-entered, has given Transurban another 10 years. That's right, another 10 years monopoly on the use of the tunnel under the Yarra in Melbourne. And not only that, it's also because they're going to help build a tunnel under the Westgate Bridge, for which they will have a monopoly for decades. And not only that, what we saw when it was initially set up was we saw public roads which were given to Transurban, which continue to be tolled by Transurban on the entries to the tunnels. This is an extraordinary situation where something that costs a few $1 billion, which could have been paid by the taxpayer, and the Victorian government could have actually put in a toll, which would have gone into redeveloping more roads, going into the hands of a private corporation, which is making money hands over fist, and which will be paid compensation up to $1.5 billion if the new tunnel they are building doesn't appear on time. This is an extraordinary situation where we have governments making deals that last decades, although they're only elected in, for 4 years or 3 years. Just an extraordinary situation. Think about it. Now, if this had been public property, from the word go, billions of dollars would have been raised through tolls, which would have gone into expanding the current system. We wouldn't have had to privatise the Port of Melbourne to find the money to build new infrastructure. But no, as a government and as oppositions, we've all decided the way forward is through privatisation, giving away public assets to the private sector, removing regulations, that's deregulation, which were put in place to protect people and people's interests, allowing the corporate sector to dominate the economy, corporatisation, and allowing transnational corporations to basically set their own rules, globalisation, in terms of trade and in terms of legislation. Extraordinary situation. If you think it's going to change by voting in one of the major political parties, well, think again. Think again. Think again. Now, there are some, as you know, I don't normally comment that much on overseas events, but sometimes you're forced to. Sometimes you're forced to look at the situation. And a few things that I found fascinating is, one, the Yellow Vest protests in France, which started spontaneously. They weren't organised by the trade union movement. They weren't organised. Started spontaneously because of the economic pressures that people were feeling. The same type of economic pressures that we're feeling here, and the same type of economic pressures which will increase during the next 12 months as economic conditions deteriorate, and how direct action can have significant positive effects. The other thing is this, America's main ally, apart from Israel and the Middle East, Saudi Arabia. Extraordinary little place. An extraordinary little place which I'm familiar with. Extraordinary place. A feudal, absolute monarchy. That's right. A feudal, absolute monarchy. As we've seen with the current situation of the 18-year-old in Bangkok, this is Australia's main ally. Sorry, the United States' main ally in the Middle East. This is the country that El Presidente visited when he first became president to sign off on a $100 billion loan, $100 billion contract for armaments. This is the country that's been bombing Yemen back to the Dark Ages. This is a country which feels immune from the most basic human decency, where critics are kidnapped, murdered, dismembered and liquefied. This is a country that continues to carry out public executions for so-called social crimes. If you renounce your religion in Saudi Arabia, it's a capital offence, punished by public decapitation. This is a country that continues to decapitate people in the streets, making IS look almost like a poster boy or poster girl. This is a country we kowtow to, trade with, honour. Just an extraordinary situation. This is a country that follows a gender apartheid line. That's right, if you're a woman in Saudi Arabia. Big problems. Guardianship scheme. Can't do anything unless you've got a bloke, a family member or somebody to tick it off. You know. So this is a country that doesn't even have footpaths because they're concerned about mixing of men and women in public space. And the reason I mention this, I mean, there's a lot of other countries in the world that are significantly evil places, inherently evil, structurally evil. You know, I could list them off now. But the thing is, this is a major ally. This is the country that has been supported, bankrolled, protected by the West for generations. Because we seem to have forgotten that when we're dealing with other countries, that somehow we need to look at their own human rights consequences. I know everybody likes to jump up and down regarding the Chinese human rights, but how about all these so-called allies of ours that have some of the most extraordinary laws that are used to socially control their populations, where people have no freedom, minimal freedom. is to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. So, what do we expect to do over the next 12 months? I'm afraid because the new year has arisen, it's the same struggle. It's the same situation. It's about inequalities in power and wealth. It's about increasing inequalities in power and wealth. It's about the state. It's about the individuals losing protections against the arbitrary exercise of state power. For example, in Thailand, if you say a few bad things about the royal family, you can find yourself in jail for life. In Indonesia, 7-year prison sentence if you criticise the president. In Nigeria, we've just currently seen some journalists jailed for criticising El Presidente there. And the list goes on and on. We've seen around the world more and more nation-states using the power of the state not to improve the lives of the people in that country, but to actually cement control in those countries via legislation. Look at Poland. Look at the legislation that's been going through. Look at Hungary. And all these nation-states that are using the power of the state, one, to enrich themselves, and two, to set parameters in place which restrict what people can say and can't say. And those people who think that somehow Australia, all right, Australia is a little bit different, think again. Think again. We have a constitution in this country which provides minimal protections for rights. It has no protections for rights apart from the right to religious freedom, which is an important right, or the right not to be religious. Again, going back to Saudi Arabia, I can assure you that 70% of the listeners would be up for execution. Atheism is a capital crime. Renouncing Islam, a capital crime. Everybody's been following this 18-year-old in Bangkok. Remember, the main issue isn't her family. The main issue is the state, which is legislation in place, which means public decapitation for people who renounce their religion, or, and hundreds of other so-called crimes. Don't get back to Australia. Do we have freedom of speech? No. The reason you listen to me today on the Anarchist World This Week is because I'm powerless, all right? Let's be realistic. I've got no power. If I had any power, I could be prescribed tomorrow by the Attorney General. Tick, bang, banned, can't speak. It's in the legislation. Go on a wildcat strike, fine $10,000 a day. Your union, if your union is involved, bankrupted. Legislation. It's there. There's a little bit of a dispute between the state and the federal government. Federal government can send in troops. Legislation. No compensation for any damage. No compensation for anybody killed. End of story. If you think I'm talking about a third world country, think again. Think of the data laws, the metadata laws. Think of all these laws that are now being put in place to actually control people and control what we can say, what we can do, how we can act, how we can associate, who we can associate with, what is a legitimate idea and what isn't a legitimate idea. Where the state becomes the final arbitrator, because in Australia there are no constitutional protections for human rights. You listen to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. And just in case you're around Melbourne town on Sunday the 20th of February, which isn't very far away, once again we'll be holding the annual commemoration for Tanaminoa and Maulboyheenner, two Indigenous freedom fighters who were publicly executed in Melbourne on the 20th of January 1842. And why do we bother? Well, we bother for a reason. And the reason is that we need to, one, acknowledge the brutality of the colonisation process. I mean, I'd like to see the 20th of January declared National Indigenous Freedom Fighters Day. These were men and women together who took up arms against the colonisers and who paid, and the two men involved, Tunaminaway and Maulboyheenner, paid the ultimate price and were hung, and the three women involved, Planobina, Putirana and Truganini, were eventually deported back to Flinders Island and then to Oyster Cove in Tasmania. So one of the main things we were asked by the Uluru Conference over a year ago was to acknowledge the past, tell the truth. By joining us at the Tunaminaway Maulboyheenner commemoration at midday on Sunday the 20th of January, you will be doing that. You will be acknowledging past. Now, if you can't make it, community radio station 3CR in Melbourne will be broadcasting the first hour of the ceremony on 3cr.org.au. Anywhere else in Australia, you can pick it up on 3cr.org.au or listen to 855 on your AM dial if you're in the Melbourne regional Victoria area. So, and then at 1 o'clock we'll be walking down to the Queen Victoria Markets to what we believe is their last resting place. It is a Sunday. It is school holidays. It's a great chance for you to bring children. It's a peaceful rally. Come along, listen to the speakers, get the children to understand what this land is all about the original traditional owners of this land, and how they paid the ultimate price for defending their land, defending their families, defending their cultures. The type of thing that we honour people for who died overseas in wars that have been fought by this country since Federation in 1901. But people we ignore. So I expect to see you there. It'll be a great day, I expect you to see you there. If you can't make it, well, you can always listen to it on Community Radio 3CR. You listen to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. If you've got any $1 stamps, throw them our way, or involved in a mass mail-out for public interest before corporate interest. Actually, 2 mass mail-outs. Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. Want to learn more about anarchism? Go to anarchistmedia.org. Want to learn more about Pipsy? Go to pibci.net. Want to learn more about Tunaminaway and Maulboyheenner? Go to tunnermaul, TUNNERMAUL.org. Want to learn more about activities I'm involved in? Go to my personal Facebook page, Toscano for the Public. You can always leave messages on 0439 395 489. If they're vitriolic, don't bother, I don't listen. You can write to me at Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. And remember, it's a new year, same struggles. Get involved, get involved, get involved, get involved. Nothing changes if you're an internet warrior. Nothing changes if you're a television slob. So, the only way things will change is if you get out of that chair, remove your finger from your mouse, and get out there and get involved. Thank you for listening to the Anarchist World this week, courtesy of the Community Radio Network, broadcast across Australia. This program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. Listen to the Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station, courtesy of the Community Radio Network, next week.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week. Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to the Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.